In this video we're going to be looking at creating a watercolour flower. We're going to try and avoid the abstract, so I know in previous videos we've done the kind of wash and line technique, but today we're going to be looking at trying to create a more realistic effect with the watercolour application. So one of the things I've started off with is I've already drawn out my outline. As you can see on the video, it's very light. You can see on my page I've already practiced a little bit up here, and the reason why I'm practicing over and over again before I apply it to my final piece is so that when I apply it to my final piece I know all the pitfalls, I know all the problems, and I can really kind of hone this in on perfecting my technique. So in your outline, what it's really important to do when you're drawing your outline is focus on getting accurate proportions and shape. You can see that my shape is more or less exactly the same, but also as well I've made sure that I've included all of these petal lines and even where the petal kind of folds over on the edges. That's going to come into play shortly when we start actually applying the colour. Now, the principles of this are exactly the same regardless of what colour you're actually going to be applying to the flower. However, it's really important that you follow the technique that's being used to create a more realistic feel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by just fetching my colour. I'm going to be using this kind of bright fuchsia here, and you can see that I'm applying it to my brush, applying the pigment to my brush, dropping it into the lid of my watercolours. I'm being nice and generous with how much pigment I'm putting on there, and then what I'm going to do is just in a separate area in that palette I'm going to apply a fair amount of water to my brush, and now I'm not going back into the pigment. I'm trying to create the lightest version of that as possible by just watering it down with plenty of water, and as you can see I keep going into the water until I'm happy with it. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to keep my strong pigment separate. I'm not going back into that yet. I'm going to keep in the watered down version, my lightest version, and I'm just going to pick a petal. So I've got my source image next to me, and I'm going to pick a single petal to just start with. So I'm going to go for this large area here, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to apply brushing towards me all the way around the edges of the lines, and I'm just going to apply that lightest colour just to that petal. So I'm not going to go over the lines, I'm not going into another petal, I'm literally just applying it into that one. Now make sure that when you go back into your paint that you're going into that watered down version of the pigment, and I'm just going to get all of that in. Now what I'm going to do from there is I'm going to apply a darker pigment into the darker areas that I can see that are at the bottom of the petal, but also where this shadow is being cast by the other petal, the second petal overlapping. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a little bit of water, not much, and I'm going to go straight into the palette pigment. I'm not using the one that's in the lid, I'm using it straight out of there, and just along that baseline there is where I'm going to add that strong element of pigment. I'm keep on going back in using a dryish brush into the pigment, and I'm just going to keep on having a quick look at my source picture, and I'm going to apply a real strong line along the base there. Now once I've done that, obviously if you were trying to create this realistic look, we've got this kind of strong line between the two pigments. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wash my brush off, and this is why it's really important that you've got some kitchen towel or tissue. Just dab it on there, dry it off, and then I'm just going to start spreading that line of stronger pigment out along the petal. Again, look at the direction that I'm using, so I'm painting out from the base towards the tip of the petal. I'm not doing it just all over the place. I'm doing it in an informed way, and I'm coming across. Now I'm going to add a little bit more water there, and I'm going to just start smoothing that out in an informed and directional manner. And I'm making sure that I'm getting rid of that harsh line that we created, ensuring that the tips are still nice and light, the tips of the petal are still nice and light. And then I'm just going to go back in now to my dark pigment, and I'm just going to again just add some detail, some darker details, using that harsh pigment, using the very, very tip of the brush, ensuring that there's not a dark line, but just in those sort of areas there. Okay, so I've got my first petal in. I think I could probably go a little bit darker in some areas, but we'll come to that as we move through. I'm just going to go back in and just make sure that that line is all blended out, and it's a nice smooth transition to the tip of the petal. Now just be careful that you're not lifting any of the paper using too much water. There's a little bit of that going on in mine, but that's fine. Once it dries, we can work over the top of that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the same technique to a different petal. I'm going to leave that one to dry in there, and I'm going to move to a different area of the flower, because if I was to go into this petal here and apply the same technique, all the colours that I've just applied would just bleed together, and you wouldn't see that clear line and clear transition between the dark shadow and the petal next to it. So I'm going to come over to a slightly different area, and I'm going to choose this big area at the top, and I'm going to just apply the same technique. So I'm going in with my really light wash of colour first, again going all the way to my edges of my line and coming all the way to the base. And again, you can see that I'm still applying it in that same directional manner, bursting out from the centre of the flower, making sure that I'm getting into all of those areas just at the base of the petal, which are going to eventually be a bit darker, and all the way to the end, making sure that the highlights and those lighter tones are left as well. So I'm just going to make sure that that's all into one petal, which you can see is quite a large petal. There we go. So again, I'm using my source picture. Now I know that these petals here are sat on top of or above the petal that I've just applied to that wash. So again, I'm going to just dry my brush off, wash it off, and then I'm just going to dry it. Not completely dry, but majority of it's going to be dry. And then I'm going to go straight into the pigment, getting a nice rich colour, and then I'm going to start looking at some of those darker areas and start applying the dark pigment in those areas. And I'm going to just concentrate on getting those in just at the base of the petal where the two petals overlap. And again, you can see that there is a solid line now where the two different tones meet. So again, I'm going into my wash, into my water. I'm going to dry that brush off, and then I'm just going to brush that line away. Maybe a little bit more water in there is needed. And the aim is to just make that line disappear, brushing the pigment out towards the edge of the petal. And then once I've done that, and I'm happy that that line's gone, I'm going to go back in, and again just working some of those darker areas that rich pigment, that solid colour, just to create those darker edges. Okay, and I'm going to repeat that process till all of the flower is filled. Now the petal I'm working on now, I've applied the initial light wash to the petal, but this one in particular has 2 or 3 areas where there is a bit of an overlap, and we can see on the source image that these areas here are quite light in comparison to what's underneath. So I'm not going to paint these with the same section. I'm going to paint the main section and then I'm going to let that dry, and then I'll come back to these at a later stage. If I try and do that now, I'm not going to be able to create that same light effect and get that clear line between the 2 areas. So I need to make sure that I'm leaving that space there in order to come back to. Now you can see that I'm applying a little bit more water than I have done previously. That's because it's a larger area of that darker, richer colour on the source picture. So the line actually comes up a little bit further. That's to create more of a wash, more of a darker, richer colour in there. These petals on towards the outside have got a quite deep, so they actually show quite a deep shadow. So again, just using that little bit of water now, having just cleaned my brush off, just to bring that wash all the way to the end. And I still want to create that kind of layer of lightness as I get towards the end. So I'm just going to wash my brush off again, just make sure that that's nice and subtle. And the transitions are quite subtle between the various colours as well. So what I'll do is I'll now finish off that petal there, and I'll leave that to dry in that area, go and work on a different area of the flower, and then once that's dry, I'll come back and I'll add a very, very light wash into those bits that overlap. And all I'm going to do now is you can see, because those bits overlap, I can just add a little tiny bit of richer, darker pigment just underneath where the overlap would be, just to create that element of shadow. And again, just working back into those areas with some darker, richer pigment to where the real dark areas would be. So the petal I'm working on now, you can see that this is going to be a much darker petal. So I've still gone in though with that light, very light wash to begin with, and now all I'm going to do is I'm going to add quite a thick wash of that darker pigment. Again, concentrating it in the darker areas right at the base of the petal. But instead of kind of washing it all out from there, I'm going to bring it all up, and I can see, looking at my reference picture, that I've forgotten to put in a bit of a pencil line there, just to tell me that actually there's a bit of a curved edge to this petal here. So I'm just going to leave a line there, and I'm going to bring that darker tone up, and again I'm going to just keep using that paper towel and tissue to just dry my brush off while I blend those colours out. And we can see that you still leave that rich dark tones in there, and again they probably just need darkening up and thickening up in the centre there a little bit more. So I'm just going to go back in and just add just some dabs of just pure pigment rather than too much water, just in that area there. The other thing you can do at this stage now is just have a step back, have a look at it, have a look at your source pictures, think if there's any areas that need darkening up a little bit. So I'm just looking at mine, and now that mine's dry, you can go back in and work into some of these areas. So I'm just looking now, and I think it looks all right, but I think probably just a couple of little areas in and around here just need to be a little bit darker. So I'm just going to go in with just pigment. So I've not applied any water to that, just a damp brush, and I'm just using just the pigment, and I'm just going in just to some of those creased areas where the two petals overlap, just adding some darker areas in there. And again, just trying to blend that line out as well, so that there's not a line between the two. And just keep looking to see if there's any areas that just need darkening up. So So I'm just looking at the areas that perhaps look like where the petals will overlap. So we know that this petal here is on top of that petal, so there is a little bit of a shadow going to be cast on the one below. So I'm just going to go around the edge of there and try and distinguish between the two areas. Now, just looking at mine, I can see that I've got some of these real dark areas in here, in and around this petal here, and in these kind of inner areas where it is very, very dark, and I want some stronger shadows. So what I've done is I've just mixed up, I'm just going to show you again. So I'm going to just go back in with my pink, my fuchsia, and I'm just going to create a nice, strong fuchsia in my palette. I'm then going to go in to what would be considered a darker version of that using my purple. So this would be an extreme darker version, would be the purple. But if, say, you're working in reds, you could go to kind of a navy or a pink or a purple. If you're working in yellows, you could go to an orange or even a brown. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix these together in my palette just to create a kind of very, very dark fuchsia, almost a purple. And I'm just going to make sure that I've got a nice rich pigment in there so it's not too washed out. Dry my brush off a little bit. And then I'm just going to work into just some of those areas, just very delicately, using the same technique. So I'm going to go in with the dark first, create that kind of darker area, and then I'm just going to wash my brush off, dry it off, and then just using a very damp brush, I'm just going to blend those colours together, just working over the top. When I'm doing this, I'm barely touching the paper, just kind of really small, delicate areas. And then what you can start to do is you can start to really build up some of those stronger, darker tones in there. Now, I would only recommend that you do this if you are feeling like yours needs some darker tones. Perhaps I was looking at mine and I was thinking that that fuchsia is probably a bit too bright, not quite dark enough to really make those shadows stand out. And it looked a little bit too much like everything was just a bit pink. So I thought by going in and just darkening up some of those areas, that might help my work stand out a little bit and just create that more realistic feel to it. So you can already see in this area how that's helping. So I'm going to now continue that in the other areas as well. Remembering to let the area dry before you start working back into it. So just check that it is dry before you start working back into it, because obviously, as we know, it'll just bleed all over the place, and you'll start going over the lines and into different areas. So you need to remember the technique we used before. We're going to move around the flower to different areas, move around the painting to different areas, different petals that don't cross over, allowing each area to dry before we come and work onto the area next to it. And again, I'm just going to work up this petal here, go back into my water, dry it off on the side, and then just dry it off on the paper towel. Make sure it's nice and just damp, not soaking wet. Then I can just blend those colours in together. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to be on to is this yellow coloured area in the middle. So the process is still the same. Couple of things that I would recommend you do before you start changing colours though is one, change and clean your brush and change your water. Make sure you've got fresh water in there, and then start off as we did before, just creating a really strong, vibrant version of the colour that you want. So I'm just mixing that yellow into my lid, and then I'm going to water that down now and try and create as light a pigment as I possibly can in that yellow by just adding lots and lots of water, bringing all that water in until it's a washed out, very, very watery yellow. And once I'm there, I'm just going to do the same thing that we did before. I'm just going to brush the yellow into that area. Ensuring that I'm really careful not to go over the petals. And then I'm just going to look at some of the darker areas which have got more rich pigment in, so exactly the same as I did before. I'm going to start to add dots this time and just little flashes, exactly the same as I did before, so they're kind of like little lines, just to try and create as much texture as I can. And the main difference this time is that I'm not going to work into them with just the water, and I'm not going to try and blend that together. I'm going to leave that. And now what I need to do is just let that dry a little bit. I'm going to create, whilst that's drying, I'm just going to create, using my Van Dyke Brown, just a nice rich brown colour for the centre. And again, same process. So I've got that brown, I'm going to water that down now to create a watered down light version of that. And then just in that small areas, just where it's a little bit still, a little bit wet, I'm just going to add that darker pigment just in the areas that I want, being very careful not to spread it too far.